Hello, I'm Jeff Paur, senior writer with RealTime Fantasy Sports. Welcome to another edition of the RealTime Fantasy Sports Show. On today's show, I'm going to give you my start, sits, and sleepers for Week 7 of the fantasy football season. Moving right along here, hopefully you're off to a very good start and you're making yourself, putting yourself in a good position to make a run in the fantasy playoffs is what I should say. Last week, I tell you I like to keep myself honest on this show. And last week went 13-13 in my picks. That tied for the worst week of my season. Unfortunately, I'm 84-72 overall. Hopefully I do better this week. It's funny how it works, though. I did not have a good fantasy week as well. A lot of my teams lost last week, unfortunately. And I guess it went along with my picks as well. So not a great week. Hopefully things are better this week. On the start, sits, and sleepers, I'll give you 3 starts at QB, 3 sits, and then a sleeper as well. I'll do that at QB, running back, and receiver. And at tight end, I'll give you 2 starts, 2 sits, and a sleeper. We always start with the QBs, and we are going to start with Jaden Daniels. That's my first start of the week. He got it going again last week. He scored 25.75 fantasy points. He had his first 3 touchdown game of the season. He did that without his number 1 receiver, Terry McLaurin. Deebo Samuel was banged up as well. Both those guys could be back in the lineup and healthier this week. I think he's going to have a really big game against the Cowboys. They're brutal defensively. They allow the most fantasy points to quarterbacks this year, 30 or more points, 4 of 5 games as well. Daniels is a must start in this matchup. He's really a top 3 fantasy QB for Week 7. My next start at QB is Caleb Williams of the Bears. 22.6 fantasy points last week. He has at least 20 points all but a game. He's been very consistent in a pass-heavy Bears offense. And I actually think the success they had running the ball last week with DeAndre Swift could actually open up the passing game even more. So I think it bodes well for Williams to have a good running attack in that offense. So I think it's good news that Swift is actually having some success on the ground. And he plays the Saints this week. They allow the 4th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. I think Williams is a very good play in this matchup. My next start is Jared Goff of the Detroit Lions. He missed on just 6 passes last week against a very good Chiefs pass defense. 2 games this year with 23-plus fantasy points for Goff. He has multiple touchdowns, 3 straight games. He gets the Bucs this week. I think this is going to be a shootout. Tampa allows the 9th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. They've allowed at least 295 passing yards 2 straight games. Goff's going to put up some good fantasy numbers here. All right, 3 of my sits now at QB. My first one is Sam Darnold of Seattle. He has actually played really well this year. I like his play on the field with the Seahawks. It seems like he's really starting to adapt to this offense well. He has at least 20 fantasy points 3 games. Unfortunately, he also has 3 games with less than 19 fantasy points. So he's been a little bit up and down, not a sure weekly thing. And a game against the Texans, I don't think is a good one for him. Texans have allowed less than 195 passing yards 2 straight games and 3 of 4. And they actually allow the fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks this year. My next sit is someone involved in that exact same game, and it's CJ Stroud of the Texans. Huge game last week, but he has fewer than 18 fantasy points each of the first 3 games he played this year. He gets his Seahawks team that has allowed fewer than 215 passing yards 4 or 5 games. They've been solid against the pass all year. I think this is going to be a low-scoring game between these 2 teams. I think Stroud is going to come back down to earth a little bit after his huge game his last time out. My next sit is Mac Jones of the San Francisco 49ers. I don't know who's going to start at QB. I guess it could also be Brock Purdy, but I think Jones is going to be the guy who starts. Either way, I'm not sure I like the QB in this matchup. Jones did throw for 347 yards his last time out, but he didn't score a touchdown in this game. And now they play the Falcons. They've been absolutely dominant against the pass this year. They've allowed less than 160 passing yards all 5 games. That's crazy. Teams just aren't able to throw against them. They've also allowed the 4th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks. I would just stay away from the San Francisco QB situation for Week 7. My sleeper at QB is Joe Flacco of the Cincinnati Bengals. Flacco didn't have a huge first game with the Bengals, but he played pretty well. He scored 20.95 fantasy points. He threw the ball 45 times. They still can't run the ball. It's going to be a pass-first offense, and that's going to be against the Steelers this week, who have allowed the sixth most fantasy points to receivers. Flacco's going to lean heavily on his top two targets in the passing game, T. Higgins and Jamar Chase. So I think Flacco could be a sneaky spot play for fantasy teams in week 7. All right, let's move on to the running back position. My 3 starts there. My first one is Jordan Mason of the Minnesota Vikings. He's been very consistent since taking over the starting role in Minnesota because of the injury to Aaron Jones. He has double-digit fantasy points, 3 straight games, touchdowns 2 of 3. I think he keeps it going this week against the Philadelphia Eagles. They allow the 8th most fantasy points of running backs. The Giants, who don't exactly have a high-powered rushing attack, ran for 172 yards against Philadelphia last week. So I like Mason to have a good showing in week 7. My next start is Rachaad White of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. White is showing he can really be an elite fantasy back when getting a chance to start in the Bucs offense. He seems likely to get another start this week with Bucky Irving hurting still. He has 17 plus fantasy points, 2 straight games, found the end zone each of those games. He's also getting catches. He has 11 receptions his last 3 games. He plays the Lions this week. I mentioned I think this is going to be a high-scoring game. Get your players involved on both sides. The Bucs are also hurting at receiver, so I think that means even more action for White, maybe in the passing game. So I think he's set up for a big workload. I like him a lot in week 7. My next start at running back is Jaylen Warren of the Pittsburgh Steelers. He returned to action last week from his injury, and he had 13 touches for 63 yards. Solid game, not off the charts by any means, but he had at least 13 fantasy points all 3 games before last week. I think he gets it going again. He's going to get a few more touches as he gets healthier, and he plays the Bengals, who are a dreadful defensive team. They allow the most fantasy points for running backs. They've allowed 139 or more rushing yards 4 of 5 games. My sits at running back. My first one's Travis Etienne of the Jacksonville Jaguars. He's really cooled a little in recent weeks after his great start to the year. He has fewer than 50 rushing yards 2 straight games. He has failed to reach double-digit fantasy points each of those games. He's slowing down a little bit, and now he gets the Rams this week, a team that allows the 3rd fewest fantasy points of running backs. Rams have allowed fewer than 90 rushing yards 3 of 4 games. I think could be another mediocre showing for Etienne in week 7. My next sit is Tony Pollard of the Tennessee Titans. He played a season low 43% of the snaps last week. Tajay Spears was on the field a lot more than Pollard. This is concerning. Pollard scored just 6.7 fantasy points in that game. He has fewer than double-digit fantasy points, 3 of 6, failed to reach 70 rushing yards 4 straight games as well. They have a new coaching staff now in place, calling the plays. So maybe they lean on Spears even more and kind of phase Pollard out of the mix there. Also, Pollard doesn't have a great matchup this week against New England. They allow the 6th fewest fantasy points to running backs. I just steer clear of him for now. My next sit is Bam Knight of the Arizona Cardinals. He has touchdowns 2 straight games. He has emerged as the starter after all these injuries at running back, but he hasn't really done a whole lot out of those touchdowns. 15 carries for just 45 yards in 2 games. He's really a touchdown-dependent player in my view. I don't think he finds the end zone this week against Green Bay. They allow the 5th fewest fantasy points of running backs. They have allowed less than 100 rushing yards all but 1 game this year. My sleeper at running back is Travion Henderson of the New England Patriots. He's really been a bust today, quite frankly, just isn't finding the field enough to help fantasy teams. He has not played more than 50% of the snaps in any game, but the big positive for Henderson, in my view, Ramondre Stevenson is just terrible right now. He averages just 3.1 yards per carry. He's fumbling all the time. He has run for less than 20 yards 4 of 6 games. Patriots have to find a way to get this running game going. If they need to get Henderson more involved in the passing game on the field to help in that way, then I think they should play him more. I know they worry about his pass protection, but hopefully they can coach him up in practice. And I think it's just a matter of time before they start giving Henderson more chances there. And if he does that this week, gets more chances against Tennessee, I think he could have a really good game. They allow the 4th most fantasy points of running backs and at least 129 rushing yards all but a game. So I think Henderson could be worth taking a shot on if you're looking for some help at running back this week because of buys or injuries. All right, let's move on to the receiver position. We'll go with the starts there. My 3 starts. My first one's Courtland Sutton of the Denver Broncos. Worst game of the season last week. Caught just a pass for 17 yards on 3 targets. but he had at least 17 fantasy points, 3 straight games. It was not a good matchup for him last week against the Jets. Much better matchup this week for Sutton. I think he gets it going. Don't worry about last week. He gets the Giants. They allow the third most fantasy points to receivers, including 240 plus passing yards 3 times this year. I think Sutton really rebounds in a big way this week. My next start is Davante Adams of the Los Angeles Rams. He is another receiver that had his worst game of the season last week, finished with just 7.9 fantasy points. He had 4 catches for 39 yards on 9 targets, but Puka Nacua is banged up. I don't think he's going to play personally, so that means Adams will be the number 1 receiver in this offense against a Jacksonville team that has allowed the 7th most fantasy points to receivers and 285 plus passing yards 4 or 5 games. I think the Rams can have a lot of success throwing the ball in this matchup. Adams is really going to benefit from that. My last start at receivers, Matthew Golden of the Green Bay Packers. He's starting to get more looks finally. He has at least 5 touches, 3 straight games, double-digit fantasy points all 3 games. He gets the Cardinals. They've allowed more than 200 passing yards every game this year and 249 or more passing yards 3 times. I think Green Bay can have success throwing here, and Golden's going to be the top target in their passing game this week. Let's look at my sits now at receiver. My first one's Jacoby Myers of the Las Vegas Raiders. Myers is not having near the season fantasy owners has hoped. Trey Tucker, quite frankly, has been the top target for Geno Smith in this offense. Myers has less than 40 yards, 3 straight games, hasn't reached double-digit fantasy points since week 2. He plays the Chiefs. They allow the 8th fewest fantasy points to receivers. Kansas City has not allowed more than 200 passing yards 2 of 6 games. So I think that actually I said that wrong. Kansas City has allowed more than 200 passing yards just 2 of 6 games. So they've allowed fewer than 200 passing yards 4 times this year. I think Las Vegas is going to struggle to throw the ball. I just steer clear of Myers at this point. My next sit at receiver is Wan'Dale Robinson of the Giants. He had one of his best fantasy games of the season last week, top 20 fantasy points, scored a touchdown. He's been the go-to target in this offense since Malik Neighbors has been sidelined. But that's not good news for him this week because he plays the Broncos, and that means Patrick Surtain is going to guard Robinson this week, and that is not good news for Robinson. Surtain just absolutely shuts down the number 1 receiver in opposing offenses, and I think Robinson's going to draw him in coverage, and that's not good news for him. I think he's going to struggle to do much here. My next sit at receiver is Michael Pittman of the Colts. He had less than 45 yards. He has less than 45 yards, 3 straight games. He's turned into more of a touchdown-dependent player than I would like, and he gets the Chargers this week. They have allowed the 3rd fewest fantasy points to receivers. They have allowed 150 or fewer passing yards 3 of 5 games. I think Pittman's a guy I would worry about this week. I would just leave him on my bench. Just isn't getting it done, and I don't think he finds the end zone in week 7. My sleeper at receiver is Trey Harris, the rookie for the Los Angeles Chargers. He played the most football of his young career last week. He played 83% in the snaps, 83% of the snaps in that game. Chargers have some injuries at receiver, so he's getting more looks. He had 4 catches for 27 yards on 5 targets. I think he could get a lot of work again this week against the Colts. They allow the 4th most fantasy points to receivers and 300 passing yards 2 of 3 games, 300 plus passing yards allowed 2 of 3 games. So Harris could be a sneaky play here if he gets more looks. He's starting to get a better rapport with quarterback Justin Herbert, and I think he could start having some good fantasy games going forward. Let's move on to the tight end position. I'll give you 2 starts, 2 sits, and a sleeper. My starts start with Harold Fannin of the Cleveland Browns. David Njoku's banged up. This means Fannon's on the field more, getting more targets. He tied a season high with 7 receptions last week, 11 plus fantasy points, 2 straight games. He gets Miami this week. They allow the 7th most fantasy points to tight ends. I think Fannon's a great play in this matchup, especially with Njoku banged up. He's going to get a lot of looks here. My next start at tight end is Dalton Schultz of the Houston Texans. 5 receptions each of his last 3 games. He had season highs last game in fantasy points with 11. He gets the Seahawks this week. They're going to shut down the receivers, but they struggle to stop the tight end. 8th most fantasy points to tight ends the Seahawks have allowed this year. So I think Schultz could have another game with 5 or more receptions here. He's been pretty consistent. I don't know his numbers aren't off the charts, but pretty good floor right now for the Houston Texans. Let's move on to the sits at tight end. And my first one's TJ Hawkinson of the Minnesota Vikings. He's really been a disappointment this year. He has not topped 50 yards in a game this year, just one game all season with double digit fantasy points. I think it could be more of the same for him this week against Philadelphia. They allow the third fewest fantasy points to tight ends, have not allowed more than 200 passing yards 4 of 6 games. So Hawkinson's a bit of a scary play here. My next sit is A.J. Barner. He's actually been playing really well for the Seahawks. 3 straight games with double-digit fantasy points, but he still has more than 3 catches just a game. So I think he can be a little boomer bust. He has to make a big play with the few catches that he's getting, and I'm not sure he makes a big play this week against Houston. They allow the 6th fewest fantasy points at tight ends, and as I've mentioned, their pass defense has been really good. They have not allowed more than 225 passing yards in any game this year. So I don't think this is a good spot to use Barner in week 7. My sleeper at tight ends, Jonnu Smith of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Smith has really been a disappointment since week 1 of the fantasy season. He has fewer than 30 yards every game this year, but he does have at least 3 catches all but a game. So he is getting some weekly chances, and he's got a great matchup. If he's ever going to have one of his huge games, I think it'll be this week against Cincinnati. They can't stop the tight end at all. They allow the most fantasy points to tight ends. Bengals have allowed at least 247 passing yards all but a game. I think Pittsburgh's going to put up some points in this matchup against a really bad Bengals defense. All right, those are my start, sits, and sleepers for week 7 of the fantasy football season. Good luck to you all in your games, and I hope you have a lot of success. This has been Jeff Paur for Real Time Fantasy Sports.